high level, think about what are the things that the Book of Mormon obsesses about. The Nephite religion is a temple religion.
And that's what God's doing in the kingdom of God, the Holy of Holies, is he's beckoning for everyone to come.
The Nephites are the people who remember that God has a family.
Welcome to Chapter 2 bonus content. I'm Jackson. This is Hayden from Plain and Precious Publishing. You're here because you have decided that this fire hose kind of feels good in your face. So we are grateful to provide you with even more information that's going to overwhelm you, but hopefully after going through it with the scriptures in your hands, you'll be able to have a greater grasp of some really nuanced views and different ways of looking at the scriptures.
David, what happened in chapter 2?
In chapter 2. So I think so chapter 2 is about Matthew 5, which is the first room of the ordinance. Mysteries of that I think Jesus calls the mysteries of the kingdom of God, and that Nephi calls the mysteries of God. And I think we're not going to go through step by step because you just read it because you just read it, and Mike and I and Jackson and Hayden have talked about it in another occasion, and the link is probably down below. But I think the opportunity here is actually I love that we're doing this, guys. I tell you why I love this, because people learn different ways, and there are going to be people who read chapter 2 and go, oh, there is a lot here. It's dense. I'm struggling. And then if they can hear us talk about it, some things will click, and they'll read it differently a second time. So I love that we're doing this. So at a very high level, Matthew 5 is the first room of the ordinance. People are led by Moses through early promises of blessings, warnings about what happens if they don't keep their commitments, a confrontation with the adversary, and they're taught how to swear oaths, which are to accept God's commitments, which are to just say yes or no, and then they get the first series of commitments. And all of this is couched every time as you have heard the old law, here is the new law, which I think is one of the indications that Moses is the one who is delivering these first room commitments to them, because that stops happening as soon as we get to room 2. It's not Moses anymore. It's no longer old law, new law. You've got somebody else leading you forward. But I want to point out one of the fun things we talk about in this book that comes up in chapter 2 here. One of my favorites, dear to my half ogre heart. Okay, it's curious. Nephi tells us 2 times in his writings that he is a big boy.
Yeah, he's large.
He's large. I am large of stature. One time is 1 Nephi 4, and in 1 Nephi 4, it is clearly to explain what's going on in the narrative. Okay? What's going on in the narrative is Zoram wants to run away, and Nephi says, I was large of stature, therefore I pinned him. Okay? And he couldn't run. The other time where Nephi says he's large of stature is in 1 Nephi 2. And he says, I was exceedingly young, but I was large of stature, and I had a desire to know the mysteries of God. Therefore, I called upon God, and the Lord visited me. Okay? Now, we're going to come back to that because it's not obvious on its face why Nephi should be telling us he's big in that passage. But I think it's actually for a very specific reason.
Okay.
And it's a reason that we start to see in Matthew 5, and that we talk about in chapter 2 here. Okay? So we are used to, look, not only do our ordinances, are they all very kind of sedate, and we know it's a symbol, and now we're going to do this symbol thing, but we actually progressively nerf them over time. We make them softer because we don't want people to be hurt or traumatized. We've done this even recently, okay, where we're softening the symbolic language, softening the actions to make sure nobody's feelings are hurt. And I understand why this is, right? We want everyone to do it, and if somebody's feelings are hurt because of gesture A or because of statement B, we take those out or we soften them to try and keep everybody included, right? That's why we're doing it. I don't think that the ordinance that Nephi knew was softened at all. I think it was physically rigorous.
Yeah.
Okay, we may talk about some of the other pieces, but some of the other pieces include, I think people came fasting. I think there are indications they may have come during a long-term fast. It may have been at the end of a month of fasting. Okay, 40 days is the period of time that's specified in Matthew 4:2 and also in Elijah's stories. I think there was a simulated death, and I think it's possible, a death and a resurrection. It's possible that they may have just said, okay, now close your eyes and pretend you're dead. But I think it's more likely that these people came fasting. They were physically worked. One of the other things that happened is I think the chains were laid upon them and they carried them for some period of time and then were told to throw them off. I think they were probably physically worked until they passed out. And this was and they probably felt like they were dying. If you had not eaten solid food, if you were like drinking only water or only eating like a Ramadan type fast, light food after sundown or something, right? So you were kind of physically a little weaker, and then you were worked hard until you passed out. I think it would feel like death, okay? And I think they punched you in the face. Okay.
Okay. Oh, that's so much stuff coming out.
And I think they punched you in the face.
That'd be so much more fun, dude.
Yeah. So
I
let's
don't know.
Now the
Not for me.
explanations.
I'm kind of a wuss.
Well, and I don't know how much they prepared you. Lehi talks about
Yeah,
not
what was
Lehi.
temple prep? What was
What
early
was temple
Israelite
prep?
temple prep like?
Yeah, Mosiah 1 or 2. I'm not looking up that. I'm going to go to Matthew, and then I'm going to go to Helaman and some other verses. But Mosiah seems to tell us that there was temple prep, okay? Because he talks about, hey, we have the mysteries written, therefore we could learn them, and Lehi could not have remembered them all, and he connects it with their education, right? So there was something. Here's the verse in Matthew 5. Okay, in Matthew 5 it says, it's I like to call this the law of turn the other cheek. The law of turn the other cheek.
Okay.
That's not what the text says. But the text says in verse 39, well, I'll read 39 and 40. So, because one of the things I'm doing here as we're reading is trying to, there is an exercise of imagination trying to see always in the text what might be ritual actions. Okay? So Matthew 5:39, this is the first room of this ordinance, says, "But I say unto you that ye resist not evil. Whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." Which, by the way, sounds like they punched you in the face twice.
Yeah.
Okay? Just for the whole other discussion, verse 40, "If any man shall sue thee at law and take away thy coat," that's a tunic, a chiton, "let him have thy cloak, your himation, your outer garment also." I also think at this point, after they punched you in the face, is you basically stripped down to extremely simple clothing and were something close to naked for the next kind of room and a half until God
Clothes you.
and Elijah clothed you in the second room. Okay?
Interesting.
But let's focus on the face punching. Is there any other indication that smiting in the face is part of an ordinance or might be a sacred gesture? That seems contrary to our experience. But let us go to Helaman 4.
Okay. Hillman 4.
This is about dissent in the church. There are dissenters in the church, and because there are dissenters in the church, their actions are leading to war with the Lamanites. Okay, but the problem is dissenting Nephites. And verse 12. Okay, now we have a magical power. The skill we develop in Sunday school is the special power to read a verse of Scripture and not have any of it enter our brain. Okay? To just read it verbally and it goes right over us. Okay?
But one of the things
We're
I
gonna
like how
resist that.
you approach something is you say, okay, why is this in here?
Yeah.
And what's the point? Is there something here that I'm not seeing?
Right.
Okay. Do you want me to read 12?
Yeah, why don't you read
Okay.
12?
And it was because of the pride of their hearts, because of their exceeding riches, yea, it was because of their oppression to the poor, withholding their food from the hungry, withholding their clothing from the naked, and smiting their humble brethren upon the cheek, making a mock of that which was sacred. Okay, do you want me to keep going, or is that?
No, keep going.
Okay,
Keep
denying
going.
the spirit of prophecy and of revelation, murdering, plundering, lying, stealing, committing adultery, rising up in great contentions, and deserting away into the land of Nephi among the Lamanites. Interesting, right? Because you also have the hungry
Yep.
withholding the food,
Yep.
and yeah.
So they're
smiting
withholding
and the
clothing and food, which the Lord provides. They're committing various sins, right? But when I saw that middle part of the verse
Yeah.
in isolation, it hit me one day like a ton of bricks, and I could not believe I'd missed it for like 48 years. Okay? It says, making a mock of that which was sacred. What are they mocking? Well, the immediately preceding phrase is smiting their humble brethren upon the cheek, making a mock of that which was sacred.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, those might be two separate things.
Mm-hmm.
But given that we've seen smiting on the cheek specifically in Matthew 5 as what looks like an action in a sacred context, right?
Yeah.
It also might be that what's going on is these people, remember, they're dissenters. These are not the Lamanites doings. These are people who we presume know the mysteries or the practices of their own people, and they are abusing their brethren with a sacred gesture.
Can I interject briefly?
Yeah.
So that's kind of Sigmund Mowinkle's assumption is that there's a ritual, there's a liturgy in ancient Israel that is tied to the king, where the king and the queen represent Adam and Eve, the quintessential king and queen of the earth, and that the king goes through a ritual of humiliation and goes into Sheol, or the pit of hell, for a period of time, and then comes back, and he's like renewed or resurrected. And it's this idea that the earth will be made fertile again. And we're back to Persephone going down into Hades. That's why we have winter, or that's why we have seasons, right? Fertility comes back when she comes out of Hades. But there's a period of time where she's in Hades. Well, the king goes down. And if you read Psalm 22, it's doing the same stuff Dave's talking about. I'm just going to read a couple verses. This isn't in the book, but
Awesome.
I have to have a reason for why I'm here.
No,
so I'll
that's-
be brief, because otherwise I'm just like an ornament. So I'll just be really brief.
But you are also handsome.
Really cute.
You
I
are
would
handsome.
not go that far, but Psalm 22:1, and by the way, this is quoted by the New Testament authors that they see this. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And then skip down to verse 12. Many bulls have compassed me. This is the king crying out. The strong bulls of Bashan have beset me around. Verse 7, they laugh me to scorn. Verse 14, I am poured out like water. My bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It melts in the midst of my bowels. Verse 16, dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierce my hands and my feet. What about the clothes? Verse 18, they part my garments among themselves and cast lots upon my vesture. Verse 20, deliver me, deliver my soul from the sword. Save me from the lion's mouth. Verse 21. So there's some really interesting things happening here in Psalm 22, and it's not just here. There are other places where the king is brought down into the depths of humility. Now in Babylon, when they had their New Year festival, the king would literally be struck on the face.
Really?
And the idea was that the priest, whoever was doing this, and maybe it's the antidikos, he would, the adversary, he would smite the king, and the king would have to confess, and they're called negative confessions. He would have to confess and say, I have never let enemies into the gates of Babylon. I have never allowed our enemies to destroy us. And he would have to prove and say his loyalty to their God. And if he exhibited tears, it was the way of showing the people that the king is subject to God. And maybe I'm not trying to muddy the waters. I'm just trying to say that these ideas of being shackled or chained or smitten, and the king as a representative of God, this kind of stuff happens, and it happened anciently. And so there are scholars that look at Psalm 22 and see this as part of of a play or a liturgy. And Psalm 23 is, you can actually break down Psalm 23. We won't do it here, but the 3-act play is literally portrayed in those 6 verses: creation, fall, atonement in Psalm 23. So what Dave's saying in the Book of Mormon is also in the Old Testament. That's kind of like my background.
That's really cool.
Yeah, but I don't want to take too much away from Dave. I just want to add a second witness to say, no, Dave's not crazy. What he's talking about, it's happening,
So
and it's
this
not just
idea
happening
of-
in the Bible.
Yeah, this idea of physicality in a sacred ritual existed, you were saying, in Babylon and in
Yeah.
Israel.
And I believe in Egypt, where
And-
Osiris is kind of bound up and stuck in a box, and then they stick him in the river. And so, I mean, this stuff's happening.
So as I read this, and I don't know if you talk about this in the book. It's been a while since I read it. It's been like 4 days. So, but Isaiah 50, Isaiah says, "The Lord God hath opened mine ear, and I was not rebellious, neither turned away back. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. For the Lord God will help me, therefore shall I not be confounded. Therefore have I set my face like a flint, and I know that I shall not be ashamed." Which I think goes along with that same. And he does talk about clothing before as well. He says, "I clothe the heavens with blackness, and I make sackcloth their coverings." And he essentially is talking about like it seems to me that this is talking about those who have hardened their hearts and the mysteries are taken away.
There's a
little bit.
great book by John Eaton where he talks about the New Year's festival encapsulated in what he calls Second Isaiah, Isaiah 40 to like 55. In those 15 chapters, the festival is reenacted. And so all the really cool, what I call the really cool Jesus chapters that are like overtly like the 4 servant songs are in those bits.
Yep.
So
Interesting.
I'll send you, we can throw it in the link in the bottom if anybody's interested in that book by John Eaton. I find it fascinating because Isaiah's doing it. It's happening in the Psalms. And Dave's going to talk about it where it's happening in the Book of Mormon. I didn't want to talk too long, but I
No,
wanted
that's
to make
good.
sure to just add another witness
Yeah, it
to
makes
that.
it so he doesn't look crazy. Like
I
it's not
appreciate
coming
that. I
out
need
of
that exact
out of
help.
no.
No, you don't
right?
need me.
That
I'm
is-
just saying.
No. People are. I am thrilled you're here. Thank you. It's also in the New Testament. So John 18:22 shows Jesus dragged before Annas after he's grabbed in the garden. And what do they do? And so this is. So you can think of this as the king bound before his enemies. Okay. You can also think about this as the worshipers who are bound and struck across the face. And I think there is reason to think that they saw what they did in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 as including the idea that they were being anointed to become kings. I think we'll probably talk about that. That's part of the Elijah connection. But John 18:22, they smite Jesus across the face.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it says his cheek, but it says that with the palm of his hand, right? An officer's hitting him in the face. But for me, the pièce de la résistance here is we go back to the sort of endowment concentration camp of the Ammonites.
Mm-hmm.
And when these wicked apostates they're throwing people into their pit of hell that they've manufactured, and they have bound, they've put in chains Alma and Amulek, and those are both mocking sacred things. And they drag them before the chief judge. We don't hear his name, but the chief judge of the city of Ammonihah. This is Alma 14, verse 14. The chief judge smote them with his hand upon their cheeks, and then taunts them. And then he does it again in verse 15. And the judge smote them again upon their cheeks. And Alma then takes the time to say, and this is from Alma's record, I think, right? These chapters, 9 to 14. Now this judge was after the order and faith of Nahor. And verse 17, he smote them again. I think it's a total of 5 or maybe 6 times in this chapter, because they drag them back out and they do it again. Verse 20, the judge also smote them again on their cheeks, and many came forth and smote them. Right? And then verse 21 is where they gnashed their teeth and spit on them, and how shall we look when we are damned? They're making their demon faces, right? They're mocking the mysteries they know that Alma and Amulek are preaching, the mysteries that people have accepted, which is causing them to be thrown into the pit, right? Like for the sake of which the Ammonites are throwing them into a pit, and they're mocking them with a sacred gesture, right? So
Interesting.
all of this Why does Nephi say he is large of stature? Let us go back and interpret 1 Nephi 2:16.
Crazy. In terms of undoing and making a mockery as well, what do? They take Christ's clothes off. They take off his robes. Like, it seems like they're almost like, you can almost look at it as like an undoing of that which was sacred, right? So they're like undoing it. I don't know. That's super interesting.
I think there's a lot of there's like a through the looking glass element here,
Yeah.
where at a certain point you kind of see everything different.
Yeah.
And I think that then means, so why did 12 years pass between me writing the first 2 books and writing book 3? Like, one reason was I kind of had to go read everything again,
Yeah.
right? Because it looks totally different once you've seen this stuff. So 1 Nephi 2:16, right? This is the second appearance of the word mysteries in the Book of Mormon. And it came to pass that I, Nephi, being exceedingly young, nevertheless being large in stature, and also having great desires to know of the mysteries of God, I cried unto the Lord, and he did visit me. Why is he telling us he's big? He's telling us he's big because he's saying, look, I was too young for this stuff ordinarily. I was exceedingly young. But I really wanted to know. I had a great desire to know the stuff that my dad, whose temple visions in 1 Nephi 1 I've already reported. And I was big enough to take the punishment. Therefore, I was introduced into the mysteries of God.
But he also lived it. They tied him up. He was on the ocean. He was attacked. He was physically beaten. Like, it's a liturgy, but it's also his lived experience.
Yeah. Although that happens all afterwards, right?
But I guess I'm trying to say it's part of it. And
Yeah.
and the toughness of, like you said, we soften the liturgy because we don't want to offend. But if you look at culturally what we do in the LDS culture, you get your endowment. What do? We send you on a 2-year mission where, I was hungry. And I didn't have anybody slap me in the face, but
I got
with
slapped in
words
the
they
face
did.
once.
I had a gun pulled on me.
Yeah.
I got spit on the face a couple times.
Yeah. Nice.
Twice, I think.
My friend had urine bombs sewn at him. People would take urine in Ziplocs and chuck them at him. And my point is,
What a
it's not
So
lollipops and rainbows. Is my point.
It's
and so
urine bombs and spitting in the face.
I won't mention the country where he went, but they don't like America. But
Yeah.
my point is, it is
Could be a lot of
this. But
countries.
what if it's also? Did you want to walk this path? It's not going to be fun. It's gonna. There's gonna be great things. But remember, opposition in all things. Joseph sees the Father and the Son. But what comes with that? Just to think about this. Yes, it's an ordinance, but it's also life. Like, life is a box of chocolates. It's you know what I mean? Like, it's not
But
all
some of the
greatness.
chocolates have like a thistle inside,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
a urine bomb. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I think that's right. Because I think people. My brother Matt asked me a very good question when I was talking about this years ago to him, and I said there is a path. I will tell you this: across scriptures, consistently there is a path, and it's the same path everywhere. He said, when you say path, do you mean it's the ordinance? Do you mean like people's life? And I said, yes,
Both.
right? Yes, both, all. It is the path that we are all on. It's everybody's developmental path. It is the path to getting into the kingdom of heaven. It is also a series of actions that are used to initiate people into sacred adulthood, and sometimes in places. It also exists in visions, right? 1 Nephi 8, that was where I started. That was the thing I was like staring at for 3 or 4 years trying to figure out. I knew it was a temple thing, and right to your point, and I just couldn't figure out what I was missing.
Plate, right? And you had your fork.
You're right, yeah. And it's also a sermon, right? And it's all of those things.
Yeah. And when I think about this, I just think about the different cultures that have rites of passage, especially for young men. And there are for young women as well, but they do differ, obviously. Like in the Masai Mara, for example, I was talking to like a...
What's the Masai Mara?
Oh, sorry. The Masai Mara is in Africa. It's a tribe. So the Mara tribe in Africa, or no, the Maasai tribe in Africa. I was there and I was talking to a 14-year-old who was getting ready to go out and do his. And what they have to do as their rite of passage as men is they have to go and kill a lion, a male lion, with a spear.
Awesome.
Yeah, I wouldn't make
which
it.
is wild, right?
Yeah.
And so, but this isn't uncommon, especially in world history, this idea that there is a physical rite of passage
Oh, yeah.
that takes someone from, their young adolescence, their childhood, you could even say for us, one is like, you could say from like Aaronic priesthood state, like where they're preparatory state, and then they do something that takes them to the next level.
And dude, it is crazy. If you read something like Mircea Eliade or Joseph Campbell,
Yeah.
right, on the subject of like nerfed, there are cultures where, as a young man, you're dragged out at the age of like 13, and you're circumcised. And the older men who are like dressing as demons to sort of protect and also scare you will. Sorry, we're saying some graphic things here, but this is the thing.
This is what happens.
Will have their penises sub-incised, so cut open again. They're old initiatory wounds, and like you live for weeks in a hut in the wilderness.
Oh my
right?
gosh.
So like getting hit in the face is actually not the most
Not
bad thing that could happen to
right
initiate
to
you
death.
into adulthood.
Yeah.
Some really violent stuff happens. You get your. This is when you get your tattoos or your tribal scars or whatever. Right? It's because the trauma is you're being transformed. You're being transformed into a higher order being, an adult or a more spiritual being, and the transformation is not. All right, Jackson. Now from now on, you're an elder, right? It's not like that.
Yeah.
It's trauma. You have to be broken and made into a new person. And so I think it's completely.
To translate it into like my nerd language, because
Yeah.
I'm a total nerd and some people
Awesome.
can identify with this. Joseph Campbell sat down with George Lucas and said, if you really want to make a movie that resonates with people, you have to use the monomyth, the hero's journey. And, Luke gets beat up, gets his hand cut off, like just about dies at the brink of death. And then he comes back in the next film and he's like, he's an elder now. He's a new person.
And I think if we're going to go back to the creation story, which is the myth that these mysteries take place inside of, you're entering the dark and dreary wilderness. You have, and from my perspective, one of the ways to look at the garden story is that the Garden of Eden is your adolescence. It is your prepubescent state, a state where things are provided for you, where you do not carry the consequences of your actions. And then, welcome to the real world. That's a thorn. There's a thistle. You know what I mean? And so if we're talking about where maybe that took place, maybe that did take place once they were cast out of the garden.
That's interesting.
And it's a symbol of the penalty, which is the consequence of partaking, the consequence of knowing what is good and bad is now you can't say I didn't know, and you are subject to those consequences. So maybe that is a symbol of those consequences.
Yeah, I love that. There's also the famous monologue of Al Swearingen in Deadwood, which maybe not everyone has watched.
I've never heard
What
either of those
is
words.
what is Deadwood?
That was a 3-season Western series.
Oh, that sounds cool.
And I'm summarizing. It's got a lot of cussing, so you don't put a link below. But there's this absolutely terrific scene where a journalist has had his. I think they came in and destroyed his press, and he comes into Al Swearingen, and who's kind of a drug dealer and a brothel owner. So I don't know why I'm using this example, but to complain, and Al hits him in the face, and he says, "Why'd you do that?" And he says, "Look, I'm summarizing to take out all the curse words. They came in and smashed up your place. That was a beating. I just hit you again. That's another beating. Stand up and give some back," right? Like it's learning about yourself that you can be hit, learning about yourself that you're going to have to endure. And actually, in context, you're going to have to endure without retaliating, right? Learning that you can take it. You can be slapped in the face and not have to pull your knife and stab somebody back, right? As Rene Girard would say, ending mimetic violence.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to imagine that as a profoundly transformative experience.
Because for those who haven't listened to this, I highly recommend it. Jordan Peterson's talks or like conversations he had on Exodus with Dennis Prager and Pageau and all these, they're amazing. And one of the things that they talked about that I never really looked at was that the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth was a step up. It was a step towards goodness.
It limits the violence.
It limits it. So it's like it's not, hey, you take my eye, I take your head, which is what it had been for human history up to that point, which is, but then Christ comes and he says, you know what? Show complete restraint. Be in complete control, not looking for justice yourself, because God will give justice, right? And so just this idea, which now that I'm thinking about it, kind of shows a 3-part space to the way God has taught, right? You have the pre-Mosaic law man, then you have Mosaic law man, and then you have, Christ man, or, you could figure that how it goes. But now let's dive into another thing that has kind of a 3-part space, which for those, we didn't really talk about this in the last episode, but those, like the number 3 in the 3-part space is integral to this whole book, right? Let's talk about Jesus' time in the desert where he is fasting in the 3-part space and some of the things that we learned in there. That was really interesting.
Yeah, so Matthew 4, 1 to 13, I think, and also Luke 4, 1 to 11 or something, basically. They're interesting because they show the same 3 episodes, but they switched 2 and 3 in the order. Otherwise, they're basically the same. So Jesus is fasting. Now, the fact that Matthew 4:2 says that Jesus is in a 40-day fast is one of the reasons why I think that people came into this ordinance in a long-term fast. Because the very next chapter is the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has a 3-part ascent. He goes up again, up again. Going up 3 times is an ascent through the temple, which had 3-part space, right? You know this because you read the book or because you listened to Mike and the team here, right, talking about this in previous podcasts. And in each time he has an encounter with Satan. I don't think the adversary is used here. They talk about the diabolos, the slanderer, and he's tempted 3 times. So like another thing that I think we can maybe see here is that although in the Sermon on the Mount we are described as encountering the adversary once, which is Matthew 5:25 to 26, and warned not to get into his debt, maybe actually we should and actually I think this is true of a lot of Matthew. I think Matthew is very much a unified piece of work, and a lot of chapters of Matthew all really bear on the same theme. And maybe Matthew is showing us that as we ascend through the temple in the experience he knows and that he describes Jesus inducting the disciples into, maybe the adversary comes back several times. And maybe he offers a series of rebuttals or temptations, and maybe we're taught to reject him, right? Like maybe the words that Jesus say and the words that Satan says in this Matthew chapter 4 might all be ritual. Maybe they're scripted. Satan confronts us and he offers this, and that's the such and such is the relationship to the ordinance you're going through, and what you say is man does not live by bread alone, right? What you say is, worship the Lord your God only, etc.
Interesting. I'm looking at these different. So let's read each of the temptations and talk about them, because I think there's some insightful things.
Okay.
So I'm in the Matthew 4:1, and I'll just read the first one. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was afterward and hungered. And when the tempter came to him, he said, "If thou be the Son of God, command these stones be made bread." But he answered and said, "It was written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God." So that first one, so once again, every single time I was reading this book, I constantly just had creation myth in my head, just
Yeah.
over and over again. I'm always trying to understand. So bread is mentioned in the creation myth, right? But it's after they get cast out, and they say,
The sweat of your face.
the sweat of
Yeah.
your face shall you receive your bread, which the temptation here is to not get your bread by the sweat of your face. It's to use your godhood, your power, to turn a stone into bread instead of making bread the way bread is supposed to be made.
Well, and also, and this is a Mike Day point, right?
The best ones.
The best points are all Mike Day points. is bread and the stone both exist in the temple. There is bread that is said to be served. This is not controversial or theoretical. Leviticus 24. There is bread in the second room of the temple.
Yep.
There is a stone in the third room of the temple, the foundation stone, right? And so, in fact, the in Matthew 7, where there's an exchange of messianic symbols, and you're asked for a symbol, and you have to provide the one you're asked for, right? There are a series of 4 temple symbols, and the order in Matthew 7 is bread and stone, right? And it's ironic. It says, which one of you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Well, the answer actually is God the Father, because you have prayed and asked for bread, and what he does is, after giving you bread, he inducts you into the foundation stone, right? But it's that order. It's the up order, bread up to a stone.
Mm-hmm.
Here, these are being offered in the down order, right?
Turn
Take
a
the
stone to
stone
bread.
and turn it into bread, right? So I like your idea of connecting this with sort of a decline and an emergence from
That which is holy.
Eden and the Holy of Holies, right? It would be trading away the stone and getting it. And again, it's ironic because it's presented as turn the stone into something useful, but it's trade away the precious stone upon which the throne of God sits and take some mere bread.
Make some new bread. Interesting. I like that. That's really cool.
I liked it as a 3-part ascent where you talked about the pinnacle of the temple, like the little wing. So we go from the wilderness, which is the outer courtyard, to the pinnacle of the temple, to the little wing. We're kind of at the temple, and then to a high mountain, and the high mountain as code speech for the Holy of Holies. And then what does he offer him? He says, worship me, and basically I'm going to give you all the kingdoms of the world. And so we're talking about kingdom, which is the Holy of Holies, the kingdom of God. Satan's offering the kingdoms of the world, which he can't give. He can't ever produce what he's saying he can offer. And so, we go from the wilderness to the Hekal to the high mountain. And I like how you talked about that also in Luke, where they go from the temple courtyard, where there's this huge conversation, I believe in the 23rd chapter or the 22nd chapter, where he's having all these conversations. Then they go to the upper room in 22, and then they go, and he doesn't use the term Gethsemane, but he says the Mount of Olives.
Mount of
Luke,
Olives.
Luke never mentions Gethsemane, but he says they go to the Mount of Olives. So we go from the courtyard to the upper room to the mount.
Yeah.
And so there's something, in the words of Richard Dreyfuss, this means something.
This means something. Well, an exceeding high mount is very close to the language of, is it Ether 3:1?
Yep.
Where he says they called the Mount Shelem because of exceedingly great height, which I think is a pun or a trick. I don't think that Shelem means high mountain. I think it means peace. But I think that what we're being shown is a temple mountain.
Yeah, it's super cool. And I this is kind of reading into it maybe a little bit too much, but I just thought that it was interesting that for those who have participated in an endowment, there are 3 specific times that Satan shows up in the endowment. And in the last one, he gets cast away. And the last 2 times in our temple that he shows up, they either say, we are waiting for true messenger. They say that they're waiting for true messengers each time, which the last 2 times that Satan shows up to Christ here, he tells him to call angels to his side as well. So messengers, angels,
that's
right?
really interesting because let's just complete that thought, right? So
Yeah.
angel, well, in both Hebrew and Greek, there's no distinction between an angel and a messenger. That's the word is angelos. It just means a messenger. In a Greek, in a Xenophon or something, an angelos would just be a herald, a messenger sent to carry a message.
Yep. And the last time that Satan shows up in the endowment as well is messengers, right? And then then he is cast out after he says we're waiting for like true messenger. So I just thought that was an interesting motif, and it's crazy to me. The more you look into all of these significant stories in the Old Testament, New Testament, Book of Mormon, there's just these three parts, and it's like there's not 4, there's not 5 on them.
Right.
Every single one of them,
It's
there's
3.
like 3.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I was having this conversation with Oak Norton of Scripture Notes recently. The oldest, best text, the closest you get to the original fount, the oldest, best ascent text, like First Enoch, it's 3. But the farther they get away, the more they forget why it's 3, and they have to start adding many levels to sort of show off.
A trillion
And you
levels.
get 7 heavens, and you get 10 heavens, and then you get 20. And so we were looking at Second Enoch together, which has 10 heavens. But the first 3 all sound right. Like the tree of life is in heaven number 3. And after that, they don't know what to put. So there's like all these different orders of angels and different angels and reduplication, and the firmament is in 2 because they don't know.
What's
right?
going on.
And they don't really remember why there are 3 heavens, and they're just trying to make it sound more impressive. And so you get 600 heavens, and right?
It's almost like
3. It's a 3-part ascent. The oldest, truest texts from Exodus 24 to the Sermon on the Mount to First Nephi 8. It's 3.
The ark.
It's
The
almost
ark,
like
yeah.
they're trying to lift themselves up, like they're taking the temple, removing it from its foundation, and having it hang up in the air with their pride. And instead of showing the symbolism that the temple was meant to show, they are instead trying to show the grandeur of the fact that they were able to build such an amazing temple.
And not to be the devil's advocate, but I'm just going to push back on all this discussion and
course.
just say, what if it's both?
Mm-hmm.
What if there are so many divisions and it's just mind-boggling? And so the story that is told is this, but there's other. I guess I'm always open to saying I don't, because having
Maybe it's
never
a
seen
different
it,
literary.
You don't know what you don't
I
know.
literally don't know because
For
I've
sure.
never
Yeah.
seen this stuff. I'm just looking at stuff because sometimes I read about Enoch's 7 because we're back to and you mentioned in your book Mary Magdalene the 7 daimons.
Yeah.
You can read it that it's complicated, but that she came from them. Right?
Yeah.
And so this idea that she's ascended the 7th heaven and that she's come down, the Greek lends itself to that interpretation.
Yeah.
And so a daimon, translated as demon, but a daimon in the Greek mindset is a being who is filled with light. It's otherworldly. And so what if I'm just open to
Okay.
other ways to look at, but once again, I know nothing. I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
look at stuff and
Yeah.
go,
Well, the numerology thing is super interesting, and I'm an early student to Hebrew. Like I'm barely just learning the alphabet and trying to
Yes.
write them.
Good job.
But one thing that I found to be very interesting is the fact that there aren't other symbols for numbers, but
Oh, yeah.
but the
just
numbers,
numbers.
and the
Yeah, it was
letters are the same thing. And so this numerology that exists, and I'm so excited to get to the point where I can actually read it because I can take all of my weird thoughts and then test them without having to call Mike up, so but
And they're clearly right. Like if you get into gematria, it can get complex, and you risk making up things that are you just want to be coincidences. But there are clearly some numbers that mean things.
for
and they
sure.
get repeated again and again.
So I'm going to throw this out there, a plug to anybody who wants to get into it. And it does both of what Dave's saying. It can be really simple and beautiful and get really, really deep and cause you head pain. But Friedrich Weinreb wrote a book called Roots of the Bible, and he shows this stuff. And I'm just going to throw this teaser out there because you mentioned in your book with the trees.
Mm-hmm.
So the river of Eden, the river in Eden parts, and as soon as it leaves the precinct, it goes into 4. Okay.
Oh, is this in the? This must have been in the. What's it called? The. Wait, which book is it? In this book?
So
or?
he mentions the trees, okay, in your book. And this is a conversation I wanted to have with you. So this is like
We're
live.
having it live.
You don't know where I'm going with this, so just bear with me.
Yeah.
Friedrich Weinreb postulates, he says, what if, and you have to relax your brain because it doesn't make sense with a normal Western mind, but what if the tree of life was inside the tree of knowledge of good and evil? In other words, it's a tree within a tree, because the river leaves Eden and it's 1, Echad, and it parts into 4. And he uses the term multiplicity. As soon as you leave the one, you're in a world of opposites and various streams. And if you take, and he does this, okay, if you write out the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then you write the tree of knowledge, the tree of life, the tree of life is, and you add it all up, he does this, it's a 1-to-4 relationship. And he postulates, this is myth, we have to relax.
Wow.
But he postulates there is no getting to the tree of life without going through the tree of knowledge. And the whole time he's saying this, I'm like, 2 Nephi 2. And
Right.
I'm doing this. And then he talks about Adam's name. So Adam is Aleph, Daleth, Mem. Aleph is the 1, Daleth is the 4th, and the Mem is the number 40. So we come from the 1, and he even says the Aleph is basically 2 yods separated by a veil. Maybe this is too much, but just the idea that
Dude, that's awesome.
we come from, you know where I'm going.
although that's the post-Babylon.
Yes,
right.
of course.
Who knows
it is.
what the earlier one?
Who knows what the early ones? But his whole point is we come through the veil. Daleth is the door. We come in. That's the 4. We come into mortality. Every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. The earth in its 4 quarters. 4 is associated with earth all over the place, and then we go into the 40, which is the Mem, the crest, which is a wave. Ma'im is the word for water. The idea that we come into the ocean of chaos. Adam, part of being a man is we leave the 1, we come into mortality, we come into chaos. That's part of what it means to be a man. And a man meaning Hadam, meaning men and women. So the whole idea, this is his whole argument. What if the tree of life, to get to it, you have to go through the tree of knowledge?
That's cool.
I know it's
because it doesn't mention. Does he mention the tree in the Genesis story? Is the tree of life mentioned before they partake of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, or do they just talk about the one tree?
I think he says 2 trees. I think they're both mentioned.
We got to pull it up.
and sorry, that's 5 minutes you're never going to get back, but I'm riffing
No, I
off
don't
what
want
Dave
it
was
back.
writing about. I just thought it was
I
really
think that's awesome, and we're gonna need
really
some
interesting.
visuals. All right, so we're gonna watch this, and I'm gonna say, "Hey,
I'd be
provide
glad to
visuals,"
send-
because
I'd be glad to send it
most
to you.
people don't know what a Daleth is.
Yeah.
Genesis 1. I'm really curious
Should be
about
Genesis
this.
2.
Genesis 2.
Yeah, so verse 9, they're both in there.
Okay.
The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now that's provocative, though, right? Oh, this
In
is
the
interesting.
midst, right?
The tree of life is in the midst. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, it's more ambiguous, right? That's super interesting because. Okay, so one of the things that I think makes all this stuff to me very convincing is the way it tends to explain just lots of little verses here and there. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Nephi being large of stature in first Nephi 2:16 is an example. Let me show you another example. So this idea that the tree of life is in the midst of the garden, but it doesn't say the tree of knowledge is in the midst of the garden, right? It's ambiguous. Maybe it implies that, not necessarily. I'm going to read you one verse that is typical. There's a verse like this in Alma 7. There's a couple of verses. There's a verse like this in 1 Nephi 10. But here's Alma 37. He's talking to his son Helaman, and he says he's talking about the brass plates, and they're preserved because they contain mysteries that the world will know in the future. So that's super interesting. Okay. But that's the sideline.
This is Alma 37. What verse?
37:12.
Okay.
And it may suffice if I only say that they, the brass plates, are preserved for a wise purpose, which purpose is known unto God. For he doth counsel and wisdom over all his works. His paths are straight, and his course is one eternal round. Now, first of all, there's a whole bunch of wisdom, counsel, and straight are very interesting in themselves. But he says his paths are straight, and his course, which is another word for path, is round. Okay? So this is a repeated image we get where the path is both straight
And round.
right? And that is a little counterintuitive, but it makes perfect sense in the context we're talking about, and it makes sense of the verse we just read in Genesis 2.
Elaborate.
Because the journey that Adam and Eve go on is straight in the following sense. They start out on the porch in the Ulam, where the tree of wisdom, tree of knowledge of good and evil, is. It is one of the 2 pillars, which they have ivy work on them. They're described as being floral. Okay, the Mishnah talks about there being grapes. People would come and hang grapes. Okay, out there on the porch. They start out there, the tree of wisdom is out there, and they go straight back to the center. And in the center is where the tree of life is. That is a straight path. The tree of life, but the tree of life only is in the center. Okay? The tree of wisdom is out on the outside. So the path is straight. The path is also round because the path starts in Eden, where you have two trees, tree of life, tree of knowledge of good and evil. You're expelled from Eden, and you are cast out in the lone and dreary world, okay? And then you come back into Eden. Now, literally, physically, you've walked in a straight line back. But the story, right, narratively, mythologically, you've gone in a circle, and
Yeah.
you've returned to the presence of the tree.
Interesting.
So
The myth of the eternal return.
the myth of the eternal return. This makes perfect sense. This is exactly what Farm Boys talked about in 1829. This is how they're
Yes,
sitting
it's
there, and they're like sitting on a pile of rocks. And as I'm working on this fence, I'd like to talk about the
Joseph Smith and Marcia Elliott both
stuff that-
smoking their
yeah,
pipes.
Yeah, with Marcia Eliana sitting there. Yeah, so I those kinds of confirmations. Or the Helaman 4:12 thing, right?
Yeah.
Why does it say smiting them on the face, making a mock of that which was sacred? Seems random, makes perfect sense,
With the rest of the scriptures.
right? That's the kind of thing that gives me confidence that this is not a figment, that this is real.
Can you say one thing again? You mentioned the pillars as they go to the temple. Will you just talk about that one more time? And because I feel like it's good to just repeat briefly.
Yeah, so there are two pillars on the porch of Solomon's temple, and they're named Jachin and Boaz, and they are described as having lily work. I think that's in Kings. And there are other connections with sort of arboreal images. So we know Herod's temple had a big, it was a vine, right? A big, I'm not sure if we know what it was made out of. Might have been like stonework, or maybe it was metal. Right there with the pillars, and people would come sacrifice produce, including the Mishnah says they would hang clusters of grapes on the vine, right? So that's all very arboreal out there. And I think those two trees, whatever the world generally may have thought of them, I think the people who went through these ordinances, what they were taught is those were the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then they were cast out in the lone and dreary world, so to speak, and returned into the presence of, it's just one tree, the tree of life.
Okay.
And it's interesting when you think of that. It's like, why would they go and sacrifice produce there? And I think maybe, it's just theorizing, that at the outset of the ordinance on the porch, you partake of one of the fruits, and that kicks off. You know what I mean? Which could be interesting. They're bringing all that produce there. You know, maybe that's a part of it.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I also wonder, I have to wonder about what that would be like in terms of somebody who was really long-term fasting. I mean, if you had been fasting, at a certain point when you're fasting, you kind of get used to it.
Yeah.
Your body's like, well, I'm now just going to eat myself. And so it's sitting there, and right? This is what happens.
Yeah.
And you're like absorbing, digesting your fat and your muscle and stuff. And you kind of stop being hungry after a day or two, right? And I wonder if actually eating a little, like, okay, you get, this is the fruit, and you get to eat, and I don't know what it is. It's like a persimmon, or it's like some grapes, right? Like, actually, that might have made the whole thing harder. It might have opened your hunger back up again.
Yeah.
Right? So you were feeling the hunger again
It's actually a good
as
point.
you went through it.
Wow. Well, chapter 2, it was a doozy. And read chapter 3, and we will see you after you make your way through Matthew 6.
It was a doozy.